A man was born under Halley's Comet and died when it returned 75 years later, just as he'd predicted. Between those two celestial events, Samuel Clemens became Mark Twain, transformed American literature forever, made and lost multiple fortunes, and watched nearly everyone he loved die before him. This isn't a story about a writer, it's a story about how a sickly child from a dying river town became the voice of an entire nation, then spent his final years wondering if any of it had been worth the cost. November 30th, 1835. Florida, Missouri. Population maybe 100 souls, and that's counting generously. The kind of place where nothing happens and nobody notices. Halley's Comet blazed overhead, visible for weeks, and down below, Jane Clemens gave birth 2 months early to her 6th child. The baby was so small, so weak, that nobody expected him to survive the night. He was named Samuel Langhorne Clemens, and he'd later joke that he arrived early and spent the rest of his life trying to make up for lost time. The comet disappeared. Sam survived. His father, John Marshall Clemens, was a Virginia lawyer who'd married a Kentucky woman and chased prosperity westward, like everyone else in America. He'd accumulated land in Tennessee, bought a couple of slaves, and convinced himself that wealth was just around the next corner. It never was. John was the kind of man who could see potential in everything, except his own limitations. He'd moved the family to Florida because someone told him the town might become important someday. It didn't. Sam's mother, Jane, was a different creature entirely. Kentucky-born, sharp-tongued, perpetually worried about her sickly youngest son. She tried every remedy the era offered. Allopathic treatments, hydropathic cures, folk medicine, prayer. Sam spent his early years marinating in various tonics and poultices, while his mother fretted and his father schemed. Only 3 of Sam's siblings would survive childhood. Pleasant Hannibal died at 3 weeks old. Margaret died when Sam was 3. Benjamin died when Sam was 7. This wasn't unusual for the era. Death was ambient, constant, unremarkable. You got used to it, or you didn't survive yourself. When Sam was 4, the family moved to Hannibal, Missouri. This mattered. Everything that followed came from Hannibal. Picture a town of maybe 3,000 people perched on the western bank of the Mississippi River. 3 steamboats a day when Sam was young, their whistles announcing arrivals like trumpets heralding kings. The river was everything. Commerce, transportation, entertainment, danger, possibility. It was a highway to everywhere and nowhere. And for a boy growing up watching those boats arrive and depart, it represented freedom itself. Sam's childhood in Hannibal would later become the most famous childhood in American literature, but that's getting ahead of things. For now, he was just a sickly kid who spent too much time indoors until his health improved enough to join the other boys swimming, fishing, exploring caves, pulling pranks that would have gotten them killed if they'd gone slightly differently. There was Tom Blankenship, son of the town drunk, who lived in a barrel sometimes and didn't go to school and was therefore the freest person Sam knew. Tom would become Huck Finn. There were the islands and the caves and the swimming holes. There was the widow who lived alone, and the rumours about her. There was the time they found a corpse. There were the slaves Sam saw every day, including the ones his father owned. Their presence so normal, it took decades for him to understand what that meant. Hannibal was small enough that everyone knew everyone's business and large enough that you could find trouble if you looked. It was respectable enough to have churches and schools, and scandalous enough to have murders and mysteries. It was the perfect size for a boy's imagination to transform into mythology. And Sam was testing his mother's patience constantly. He was the kind of kid who'd sneak out at night, who'd skip school to go fishing, who'd organise elaborate pranks and then look innocent when confronted. Jane Clemens couldn't stay angry at him. He had a gift for charming his way out of consequences, offering his good nature as bond for his domestic crimes. School was intermittent. Sam learned to read and write, absorbed enough arithmetic to get by, and spent more time daydreaming than studying. The formal education of the era was brutal anyway. Memorization, recitation, beatings when you failed. He'd later claim his education was interrupted by school, which was typical Twain, taking a real complaint and turning it into a joke. What he really learned came from watching and listening. The steamboat pilots, who were gods among men, the travellers passing through with stories from New Orleans and St. Louis, the slaves who sang and told stories and maintained their humanity in a system designed to strip it away, the town characters who became templates for fictional ones, the rhythms of Mississippi River speech, which would later revolutionize American literature by proving that vernacular could carry meaning as well as fancy language. Then everything changed. March 24th, 1847. John Marshall Clemens died. Pneumonia probably, though the diagnosis wasn't certain. He was 49 years old and died more or less broke despite decades of chasing prosperity. His last words to Sam's older brother Orion were instructions to take care of the family. Sam was 11. His formal education ended immediately. The family needed money, and childhood was a luxury they could no longer afford. He became a printer's apprentice. This meant setting type by hand, learning to read backwards, getting paid in food scraps. The work was tedious and exacting and absolutely crucial to his development as a writer. Because to set type, you had to read everything. News stories, advertisements, poetry, essays, gossip columns. Hours every day spent absorbing how written language worked while your hands assembled it letter by letter. The Hannibal Courier paid him in meals. Later he worked for his brother Orion's newspaper, the Western Union, where he got to write occasionally between typesetting duties. His first published work appeared when he was 15, a sketch about a local event that people found funny enough to remember. At 18, Sam left Hannibal. Not forever, he thought then, just to see what else was out there. He worked as a printer in St. Louis, New York City, Philadelphia, East Coast cities that were nothing like the river town he'd grown up in. He wrote articles, got a few published, made a little money, learned that the world was bigger and stranger than Missouri had prepared him for. But the river kept calling. In 1857, at 21, Sam Clemens headed back toward the Mississippi with a plan to make his fortune in South America. He'd read about opportunities there, convinced himself he could get rich in the coca trade. It was the kind of half-baked scheme his father would have loved. He got as far as New Orleans before the plan collapsed. Turns out there weren't regular ships to South America from New Orleans. Who knew? Sam was stranded in a city he couldn't afford, with a dream that had evaporated and no idea what to do next. That's when he saw the steamboats. Every boy who grew up on the Mississippi wanted to be a pilot. It was the most prestigious job on the river, required immense skill and knowledge, and paid better than anything else available to someone without formal education. Pilots were kings. They commanded vessels worth thousands of dollars, made life and death decisions, and answered to no one once they were at the wheel. Sam approached Horace Bixby, a respected pilot, and convinced him to take on an apprentice. The fee was $500, payable from Sam's first wages after he got his license. Bixby agreed. What followed was 17 months of the most intensive education Sam ever received. Bixby was a stern teacher who demanded perfection because anything less could sink a boat and kill everyone aboard. Sam had to memorize the entire Mississippi River from New Orleans to St. Louis, every sandbar, every reef, every snag, every landmark, 1,200 miles of constantly shifting waterway where yesterday's safe passage might be today's death trap. He learned to read the river's surface like a book. A slight ripple meant a submerged log. A smooth patch meant deep water or hidden rocks depending on context. The shape of the current told you where the channel was. The colour of the water indicated depth and obstacles, and it all changed constantly as the river rose and fell with seasons and weather. More than memorizing, he had to understand. Why did the river behave this way? How would it change in different conditions? What did this pattern mean versus that pattern? It wasn't enough to know where dangers were. You had to predict where they'd be next week. The training was relentless. Bixby would wake him at any hour to quiz him. "What's that landmark? How deep is the water here? Where's the channel in this fog?" "Get it wrong?" and Bixby would tear into him. "Get it right," and Bixby would nod and ask something harder. But Sam loved it. This was the first time in his life he'd found something that challenged every bit of his intelligence and rewarded mastery with genuine power. Pilots weren't clerks following orders. They were craftsmen exercising judgment, making decisions that mattered. He also learned the steamboat culture, the hierarchy, the codes, the rivalries between boats and pilots, the passengers who treated pilots like servants, and the ones who understood what they were watching, the cargo handlers and engineers and deckhands who kept the boats running, the ports along the river, each with its own character and commerce. And he learned about death, because the river killed people, boilers exploded, boats hit snags and sank, fires broke out, people fell overboard. The Mississippi was beautiful and profitable and utterly indifferent to human life. In 1858, tragedy struck closer than Sam had imagined possible. He'd convinced his younger brother Henry to work on the steamboats, got him a job as a mud clerk on the Pennsylvania. Sam was on the same boat initially, working under a pilot he despised. After a confrontation, Sam was transferred to another vessel. On June 13, 1858, the Pennsylvania's boiler exploded near Memphis. The blast killed several people instantly. Henry was badly scalded, but alive. Sam rushed to Memphis when he heard, found Henry in a temporary hospital, with burns covering most of his body. For 8 days, Henry lingered. Then he died. Sam never forgave himself. He'd gotten Henry the job. He'd put his brother on that boat. If Sam had stayed on the Pennsylvania instead of getting transferred, maybe he could have prevented the explosion somehow. Or maybe he'd have died too. The guilt would follow him for the rest of his life, surfacing in his fiction, in his fascination with premonitions and fate, in his periodic depressions. Years later, he'd claim he'd dreamed of Henry's death a month before it happened. He'd seen his brother lying in a metal casket in a specific room wearing a specific suit with white flowers on his chest. When Henry actually died, Sam claimed, the scene matched his dream exactly down to the flowers. Maybe he did dream it. Maybe memory reshaped the dream after the fact. Maybe he invented the whole thing. What matters is that Sam Clemens believed in the dream, believed he'd been given a warning he failed to heed, and that failure haunted him. But he kept working, finished his apprenticeship, got his pilot's license in 1859. For the next 2 years, he was a Mississippi River pilot, one of the elite commanding steamboats and earning good money and living the dream he'd had since childhood. Then the Civil War started and the dream ended. The Mississippi became a battleground. Traffic ceased. Sam's career as a pilot was over before he'd really begun. April 1861. Sam was 25 years old, unemployed, watching his country tear itself apart over slavery and states' rights and all the other issues that had been building for decades. Missouri was a border state, split between Union and Confederate sympathies. Hannibal leaned southern, but it was complicated. Sam joined a Confederate militia unit called the Marion Rangers. He'd later write about this experience in The Private History of a Campaign That Failed, depicting himself and his friends as incompetent would-be soldiers who spent 2 weeks blundering around the countryside before their unit disbanded. The tone is comic, self-deprecating, but there's darkness underneath. They may have killed someone. Sam's not sure. They shot at a stranger on a horse one night, and the man fell. Was he a Union scout? A civilian? They didn't stay to find out. After 2 weeks, the Marion Rangers ceased to exist. Sam's military career was over. He'd spent the rest of his life dodging questions about which side he'd supported, making jokes to avoid answering directly, letting people assume what they wanted. His brother Orion, meanwhile, had gotten himself appointed secretary to the territorial governor of Nevada. Orion invited Sam to come west with him, away from the war, away from the river, toward whatever opportunities the frontier might offer. Sam accepted. They travelled by stagecoach across the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountains, a journey of nearly 3 weeks that cost $200 and nearly killed them several times. But they made it. Carson City, Nevada. A dusty territorial capital where fortunes were supposedly waiting to be claimed from silver mines in the nearby mountains. Sam had no idea what he was doing. He had no experience with mining, no capital to invest properly, no understanding of how the industry actually worked, but everyone around him was getting rich. Or so they claimed, and Sam figured he'd get rich too. He didn't. He spent the next year and a half failing spectacularly at mining. Not for lack of trying. Sam and a partner staked claims, filed paperwork, dug holes in the desert, looking for silver veins that would make them millionaires. They found nothing. Or rather, they found plenty of rock that might contain silver, but extracting it required capital and equipment they didn't have. The whole enterprise was a lesson in how dreams collide with reality. Men around him were supposedly striking it rich. Stories circulated constantly. Someone found a vein worth thousands. Someone sold a claim for a fortune. Sam heard these stories, believed them, kept digging. The Nevada Territory in the early 1860s was pure chaos. Prospectors everywhere, mining camps appearing overnight, saloons and brothels and violence. Everyone was convinced the next big strike was just around the corner. Sam was no different. He lived in tents and crude cabins, ate poorly, worked hard, and accomplished nothing of value. By late 1862, he was broke and desperate. The mining dream was dead. He needed actual income, not speculation. So he did what he'd always done when he needed money. He turned to writing. The territorial enterprise in Virginia City was the region's leading newspaper, covering the mining boom with a mix of facts and wild exaggeration. Sam started sending them letters from the mining camps, humorous sketches about life in the diggings. The editor liked them, offered him a job as a reporter, $25 a week. Sam accepted immediately. He moved to Virginia City in September 1862 and started working as a full-time journalist. This was the moment everything changed. Not immediately, not obviously. But this job, this newspaper, this chaotic mining town, this was where Samuel Clemens began transforming into Mark Twain. The work was unlike anything he'd done before. The territorial enterprise wanted sensation. They wanted stories that sold papers. Truth was negotiable. If the facts weren't interesting enough, you improved them. Sam discovered he had a talent for this. He could take a mundane incident and spin it into something hilarious or scandalous, or both. He wrote about mining claims and legal disputes and local characters, but he wrote with a voice that was distinctly his own. Sharp, satirical, willing to mock anyone, including himself. In early 1863, he signed a piece with the name Mark Twain for the first time. The riverboat term, 2 fathoms deep, safe water, whether he chose it for sentimental reasons or because it sounded good, nobody knows. He'd tell different stories about the name's origin throughout his life, contradicting himself cheerfully. What matters is that the name stuck. Mark Twain, the persona, was born in the pages of the territorial enterprise, and that persona was louder, funnier, more confident than Sam Clemens had ever been in person. The newspaper gave him freedom to experiment. He wrote hoaxes, completely fabricated stories presented as news. One claimed that a petrified man had been found in the desert, sitting in a cave, perfectly preserved. The description was absurd, clearly impossible, but other papers reprinted it as fact. Sam was delighted. He'd proven that people would believe anything if you wrote it with enough authority. He also wrote feuds with other journalists, exchanging insults through their respective newspapers. These weren't real conflicts. They were performances, entertainment for readers who enjoyed watching writers attack each other in print. Sam was good at it. His insults were creative, his timing sharp. He understood that journalism in the Nevada territory wasn't about informing the public. It was about keeping them entertained. But the humour had an edge. Sam was developing a style that would define his later work. He wrote about hypocrisy, about pretension, about the gap between what people claimed to be and what they actually were. He mocked the wealthy mine owners who'd gotten rich through luck and then acted like they'd earned it through virtue. He made fun of politicians, of preachers, of anyone who took themselves too seriously. This didn't always go over well. Virginia City was a rough place. Men settled disputes with guns. Sam's pen got him into trouble more than once. He wrote something insulting about a rival editor's paper. The editor challenged him to a duel. Sam, who had no interest in dying over a joke, left town, just packed up and moved to San Francisco. May 1864. Sam was 28 years old, unemployed again, but this time with a reputation. He'd made a name for himself in Nevada. Newspapers in California knew who Mark Twain was. He found work almost immediately, writing for the San Francisco Call and other papers. He also started contributing to literary magazines, expanding beyond straight journalism into sketches and stories. San Francisco was different from Virginia City. Bigger, more established, more sophisticated. Sam had to adjust his style slightly. The California audience wanted humour, but they wanted it polished. He learned to refine his voice to keep the sharp observations while toning down the roughness. And he met other writers, people who took literature seriously, who talked about craft and technique. Bret Harte was there, already making a name for himself with stories about the California frontier. Sam Learn, D from Harte, absorbed his approach to local colour writing, the way he captured dialects and regional characteristics. But San Francisco wasn't entirely welcoming. The city had established literary circles, and Sam was an outsider, a former riverboat pilot and failed miner who wrote for newspapers. Not exactly the prestigious background that opened doors. He was also broke most of the time. Freelance journalism paid poorly. He lived in cheap boarding houses, borrowed money from friends, and tried to figure out his next move. Then in 1865, everything changed. A friend told him a story, just a casual anecdote about a jumping frog contest in Calaveras County. A man had trained a frog to jump, bet money on it, lost when someone filled the frog with buckshot. Simple story, nothing special. Sam took that story and transformed it. He wrote Jim Smiley and His Jumping Frog, a tale told in the voice of a garrulous miner who wouldn't stop talking. The story meandered, digressed, circled back on itself. The humour came from the telling, not the plot, from the narrator's complete inability to get to the point, from the absurdity of grown men taking frog jumping seriously. The story appeared in the New York Saturday Press in November 1865. Within weeks, it had been reprinted in newspapers across the country. Mark Twain became a national name overnight. People loved it. The humour was distinctly American, different from the European-influenced style that dominated literary magazines. It captured something about the West, about the tall-tale tradition, about the way ordinary people actually talked. Sam had found his voice. Not entirely. He was still developing, still figuring out what he could do, but the jumping frog proved he could write something that resonated beyond regional newspapers. He could reach a national audience. Editors started approaching him. The Sacramento Union offered to send him to the Sandwich Islands, Hawaii, to write a series of travel letters. 4 months of all expenses paid, decent money, and the chance to see somewhere completely new. Sam accepted. He sailed for Hawaii in March 1866. The trip was supposed to be straightforward. Go to Hawaii, write entertaining letters about the exotic location, come back. But Sam turned it into something more. He didn't just describe the scenery. He He observed the culture, the politics, the economic systems. He talked to missionaries and native Hawaiians and merchants. He climbed a volcano. He investigated a maritime disaster, interviewing survivors of a shipwreck. The letters he sent back to the Sacramento Union were funny, yes, but they were also substantive. He was becoming more than just a humorist. He was developing as a serious writer who could handle complex subjects while keeping readers entertained. When he returned to San Francisco in August, he had an idea. What if he could make money by lecturing, reading his work aloud to paying audiences? It was risky. Public speaking terrified him. He'd never done anything like it. But other writers were doing lecture tours, and they seemed to make decent money. Sam decided to try. He rented a hall in San Francisco for October 2nd, 1866, advertised his lecture about the Sandwich Islands, spent the days before convinced nobody would show up. The hall filled, over 1,000 people. Sam walked onto the stage, terrified, and started talking, and discovered he was good at it. The timing he'd developed in his writing translated perfectly to live performance. He knew when to pause, when to speed up, when to deliver a line deadpan. The audience loved him. He gave more lectures across California and Nevada. Each one built his confidence and his reputation. By the end of 1866, Mark Twain was a successful lecturer and a known writer, but he wasn't satisfied. He wanted more. He wanted to see the world beyond the American West. He wanted to write a book. In 1867, he got his chance. An excursion company was organising a luxury cruise to Europe and the Holy Land. 5 months, dozens of cities, the first major organised tour of its kind. Sam convinced the Alta California newspaper to pay his way in exchange for travel letters. He borrowed money for the remainder of the fare and booked passage on the Quaker City. The voyage would change his life in ways he couldn't predict. He'd meet people who would become lifelong friends. He'd see things that would fuel his writing for years. And he'd encounter a young woman whose brother would show him a photograph that would make Sam fall in love before he'd even spoken a word to her. But first, he had to survive 5 months aboard a ship with a group of tourists whose company would drive him halfway to madness. The Quaker City departed New York on June 8, 1867. The passenger list read like a directory of respectable American society. Retired businessmen and their wives, ministers, a former lieutenant governor, wealthy tourists who could afford the steep fare, and one journalist from California who'd borrowed money to be there. Sam expected adventure. What he got was boredom punctuated by moments of genuine interest and long stretches of enforced socializing with people who thought dancing was sinful. Most of the passengers were older, conservative, and deeply religious. They held prayer meetings. They complained about the ship's provisions. They argued about proper Sabbath observance. Sam found them insufferable. He wrote letters to the Alta California, mocking the pious tourists, calling them the pilgrims. His observations were sharp and often cruel, but they were also funny. The contrast between the passengers' lofty spiritual aspirations and their petty complaints about accommodations made for good material. But there were exceptions. Among the younger passengers, Sam found kindred spirits, men who wanted to actually enjoy the trip rather than endure it as some sort of moral test. One of them was Charles Langdon, 18 years old, from Elmira, New York. Charlie became part of Sam's inner circle aboard the ship. They visited the Azores, Gibraltar, Tangier, Marseille, Paris, Genoa. Each stop brought new experiences. Sam climbed Vesuvius, walked through the ruins of Pompeii, stood in the Colosseum, visited the Louvre. He was seeing things he'd only read about, and he was writing it all down. Not with the reverence the guidebooks demanded, but with his own particular brand of irreverent observation. In Paris, he noted that the can-can dancers were less shocking than advertised. In Venice, he complained about the smell of the canals. He described the old masters' paintings with a critical eye that would have horrified the art experts. When everyone else was prostrating themselves before cultural monuments, Sam was asking whether they were actually worth all the fuss. This approach would become the foundation of The Innocents Abroad. He wasn't interested in repeating what every other travel writer said. He wanted to show what an ordinary American actually thought when confronted with the European culture. The gap between expectation and reality. The humour in taking sacred cows and examining them with practical, unimpressed eyes. The ship sailed east. Constantinople, Smyrna, Beirut, then the Holy Land. Palestine was the main destination for many passengers. They'd come specifically to walk where Jesus walked, to see the sacred sites, to have their faith confirmed by geography. Sam went along, but his writing about the Holy Land was complicated. He was moved by some of what he saw: the old city of Jerusalem, the Mount of Olives, the Sea of Galilee. But he was also skeptical of the manufactured relics and the guides who claimed every rock and tree had biblical significance. He walked the paths, he listened to the stories, and he wrote it all down with a mixture of genuine interest and sharp criticism. The tour stretched on. By the time they reached Egypt in October, Sam was exhausted. 5 months of travelling with the same group of people, 5 months of prayer meetings and complaints and forced cheerfulness, but he'd accumulated material. Notebooks full of observations, letters he'd sent back to California newspapers, the raw material for a book. More importantly, something had happened on the voyage that would change his life. Charlie Langdon had shown Sam a picture, a miniature portrait of his sister, Olivia. Sam looked at it and later claimed he fell in love immediately. Whether that's true or romantic exaggeration doesn't matter. What matters is that when the Quaker City returned to New York in November 1867, Sam accepted an invitation to visit the Langdon family in Elmira. He met Olivia Langdon on December 27th, 1867. She was 22, refined, educated, from a wealthy family, everything Sam wasn't. Her father, Jervis Langdon, had made a fortune in coal and lumber. The Langdons lived in a mansion. They were cultured, respectable, deeply religious. Olivia had been semi-invalid for years after a fall on ice when she was 16, though she'd recovered by the time Sam met her. Sam was smitten. Within days, he proposed marriage. Livy said no. Of course she said no. She barely knew him. He was a rough-edged Westerner with a reputation for drinking and irreverent humour. She was a proper young lady from a good family. The match made no sense. But Sam was persistent. He started writing her letters. Long letters, nearly every day. He courted her with words, which was his strength. He presented himself as someone who could be reformed, who wanted to be better, who saw in her the possibility of becoming the man he ought to be. Livy's family was sceptical. Her father investigated Sam's background, wrote to people who knew him. The responses weren't encouraging. References described Sam as brilliant but unreliable, talented but unpredictable. Not the kind of man you'd want your daughter to marry. But Jervis Langdon made a remarkable decision. He told Sam he'd take him at his own estimation rather than rely on what others said. If Sam claimed he could be a good husband, Jervis would give him the chance to prove it. The engagement wasn't immediate. Livy rejected Sam's proposal twice more before finally accepting in November 1868. They'd been courting for nearly a year. During that time, Sam had been working on turning his Quaker City letters into a book, editing, expanding, organising the material into a coherent narrative. The Innocents Abroad was published in 1869. It was unlike any travel book Americans had read before. Most travel writing of the era was either dry reportage or flowery descriptions of cultural monuments. Sam's book was funny, irreverent, and honest in ways that felt revolutionary. He poked fun at European pretensions. He questioned whether old paintings were actually beautiful or just old. He described fellow tourists as honestly as he described tourist sites. The book was an immediate success. It sold thousands of copies in its first year, tens of thousands eventually. Sam had written a bestseller. He'd proven he could make money with his pen, and he'd done it by being himself, rather than trying to sound like the respectable travel writers of the day. Sam and Livy married on February 2nd, 1870, in Elmira. Jervis Langdon bought them a house in Buffalo, New York, where Sam had taken a job as editor and part owner of the Buffalo Express newspaper. It was a wedding gift, the house fully furnished, a gesture of extraordinary generosity. Sam was joining a wealthy family, and they were making it clear he'd be supported. The early months of marriage were happy. Sam was in love. He had a successful book. He had stable employment. Everything seemed to be falling into place. Then reality intervened. Livy's father fell ill, cancer. He died in August 1870, just 6 months after the wedding. Livy was devastated. She'd been close to her father. Then Livy became pregnant. Their son, Langdon Clemens, was born November 7th, 1870. Premature, weak, sickly from the start. Livy herself fell seriously ill after the birth, possibly typhoid fever. For months, the household was consumed with illness. Livy's friend Emma Nye came to help nurse her and ended up contracting typhoid herself. She died in September 1870. Sam was overwhelmed. His wife was sick. His infant son was failing to thrive. His father-in-law was dead. His household was in chaos, and he was trying to work, to edit the newspaper, to write, to make enough money to support his new family. He hated Buffalo, hated the newspaper work, hated the pressure and the responsibility. By 1871, he'd sold his interest in the Express, at a loss, and moved the family to Hartford, Connecticut. Hartford had a thriving literary community. Other writers lived there. It seemed like a better place to settle. They rented a house in the Nook Farm neighborhood, an area popular with artists and intellectuals. Harriet Beecher Stowe lived nearby. So did Charles Dudley Warner. Sam could imagine building a life there, being part of a community of writers rather than isolated in Buffalo trying to run a newspaper he didn't care about. But Langdon, their son, remained weak. He caught diphtheria in spring 1872, didn't recover. Died in June, not yet 2 years old. Sam blamed himself. He'd taken the boy out for a carriage ride. Langdon had caught cold. The cold had developed into diphtheria. If Sam had been more careful, more protective, the boy might have lived. Livy was pregnant again. Their daughter, Olivia Susan, called Susie, was born in March 1872, before Langdon died. So the household moved from joy to grief within months. A new baby and a dead son. Sam poured himself into work. It was what he knew how to do. When life was unbearable, he wrote. He was working on a novel. Roughing It, his account of his years in Nevada and California, had been published in 1872 and sold well. Now he wanted to try something different. Fiction. A novel set in England about a prince and a pauper who switch places. The idea had been forming for years. He'd outlined it, drafted sections, but hadn't committed to finishing it. Instead, he started another project. A collaboration with his neighbour, Charles Dudley Warner. The two men had been complaining about the popular novels of the day. Their wives challenged them to write something better, so Sam and Warner co-wrote The Gilded Age, a satirical novel about speculation, corruption, and greed in post-Civil War America. The book was published in 1873. It sold reasonably well and gave a name to an era. The Gilded Age. The phrase stuck. But the novel itself wasn't Sam's best work. Too sprawling, too many characters, the collaboration showing in the uneven tone. Still, it proved he could write fiction, that he could sustain a narrative beyond humorous sketches and travel writing. The family was growing. Clara, their second daughter, was born in 1874. The rented house was too small. Sam decided to build. He bought land in Nook Farm and hired architect Edward Tuckerman Potter to design something spectacular. The result was a massive Victorian mansion with 19 rooms, turrets, balconies, ornate woodwork. It cost over $40,000, far more than Sam had planned to spend. But it was magnificent. The house had a conservatory, a library with a carved mantelpiece from Scotland, a billiard room on the 3rd floor where Sam could smoke and work without disturbing the family. The kitchen was in the basement. The servants' quarters were separate. It was designed for entertaining, for hosting the literary and social gatherings that were becoming part of Sam's life. They moved in during 1874. For the next 17 years, that Hertford house would be home, the place where Sam did his most important work, where he raised his daughters, where he became not just Mark Twain the writer, but Mark Twain the public figure, the celebrity, the man everyone in America seemed to know. But maintaining the house required money. More money than Sam was making from books alone. He needed a steady income. Lecturing provided that. He'd been doing speaking tours since 1866, and he was good at it. Audiences loved him. He could fill halls across the country. The pay was substantial, so he toured. Fall and winter months, he'd travel, giving the same lecture night after night in different cities. It was exhausting. The travel wore him down, but it paid for the house, paid for the servants, paid for the lifestyle Livy was accustomed to and that Sam wanted to provide. Writing happened in the summers. The family would go to Quarry Farm in Elmira, the home of Livy's sister, Susan Crane. Susan had a small octagonal study built for Sam, set apart from the main house. It had windows on all sides, a desk, quiet. Sam could work there uninterrupted, away from the demands of the household, the distractions of Hertford, the pressure of being Mark Twain. At Quarry Farm in summer 1874, he started writing about his Missouri childhood, stories about a boy named Tom Sawyer, adventures on the Mississippi, treasure hunts and murders and romance. The stories came easily. He was drawing on memory, on the Hannibal of his youth. Tom Sawyer was partly him, partly the boys he'd known. Huck Finn was based on Tom Blankenship, the town drunk's son who'd been Sam's friend. The manuscript grew, chapter by chapter. The white picket fence, the murder in the graveyard, Becky Thatcher, and the cave. It was coming together faster than anything he'd written before. Pure pleasure, this kind of writing. No research required, no facts to verify, just memory and imagination blended until you couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. The book was published in December 1876, though it had been finished the previous year. American publication got delayed. British edition came first. Sam wasn't happy about that, but at least it was out. Reviews were mixed. Some critics found it too crude, too vernacular. Children's literature was supposed to be improving, morally instructive. Tom Sawyer was neither. It was about a boy who lied, stole, played hooky, and generally caused trouble. But kids loved it. Adults too, the ones willing to read something that didn't preach. Sales were decent, not spectacular, but steady. The book would keep selling for decades, but Sam didn't know that yet. All he knew was that he'd written something true, something that captured what it felt like to be a boy in Missouri before the war. While working on Tom Sawyer, another character had emerged. Huck Finn, the boy on the margins, Tom's sidekick, but more interesting in some ways. Freer, less constrained by civilization. Sam had already decided Huck needed his own book, but that would come later. First, there was money to think about. The Hertford house was expensive, not just to build but to maintain. Servants, property taxes, heating bills in winter. Livy ran the household efficiently, but efficiency only went so far when you were trying to maintain a mansion. Sam needed income, steady, reliable income. Books didn't provide that. The money came in unpredictable bursts, royalties paid quarterly, sometimes delayed. Lecturing was the answer. Sam had been doing speaking tours since the 1860s. He was good at it, better than good. Audiences adored him. He could make them laugh, make them think, hold their attention for an hour or more with nothing but his voice and presence. The pay was substantial, $100 per lecture, sometimes more. Do 30 lectures in a season and you had real money. So he toured, fall and winter, leaving Livy and the girls in Hartford. He'd travel by train from city to city, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, sometimes as far west as Chicago or St. Louis. Each night a different hall, different audience, same routine. Walk on stage, pause, let the applause settle. Begin slowly, conversationally. Build to the funny parts, time the pauses perfectly. Watch the audience, gauge their reactions, adjust accordingly. It was performance, theatre. Sam had learned timing from years of telling stories in saloons and newspaper offices. He knew how to work a crowd, when to speed up, when to slow down, when to drop his voice so people leaned forward to hear, when to raise it for emphasis. The lectures weren't speeches exactly. They were crafted narratives, stories with structure, beginning, middle, end, characters, conflict, resolution, just like his writing, but spoken. The tours were exhausting. The travel wore him down. Bad food in railroad dining cars, uncomfortable hotel beds, constant movement. No time to write, no time to think. Just perform, sleep, travel, perform again. But the money was good, and Sam was building his reputation. Mark Twain wasn't just a name in newspapers and on book covers. He was a presence, a personality. People wanted to see him, hear him, shake his hand. Back at Quarry Farm, in summer 1876, he started a new project, a book about Huck Finn. He'd been thinking about it since finishing Tom Sawyer. This time the story would be bigger, darker, more ambitious. Huck would run away from his abusive father. He'd team up with Jim, a runaway slave. They'd float down the Mississippi on a raft. The writing went well at first. The early chapters poured out. Huck's voice was clear, distinct from Tom's, more colloquial, more honest. Sam was writing in dialect, capturing how people actually talked in Missouri. Not proper grammar, not refined language, the real thing. Critics would later call this revolutionary. At the time, Sam just knew it sounded right, but then he got stuck. Around chapter 16, the story stalled. He didn't know where to take it next. The raft was floating south, deeper into slave territory. That was the wrong direction. Huck and Jim needed to get north, to freedom. But Sam had written them into a corner, so he set the manuscript aside, put it in a drawer, moved on to other things. This would become his pattern with Huckleberry Finn. Write for a while, get stuck, stop, come back months or years later. The book took 7 years to complete. Not because Sam was slow, but because he kept abandoning it. The story was harder than Tom Sawyer, more complicated, more serious underneath the humour. Meanwhile, there was another book to write, a travel book. Sam had been taking notes about his riverboat days, his memories of learning to pilot steamboats. He'd written some of it years earlier. Now he expanded it into Life on the Mississippi, published in 1883. The book combined memoir and travelogue, part nostalgia for the old river days, part observation of how the river had changed since the war. To research the second half, Sam travelled down the Mississippi in 1882. First time he'd been back since before the war. 20 years. The river was different, smaller somehow. The romance was gone. Steamboats were being replaced by railroads. The towns had changed, but the river itself, the physical reality of it, was still there. Still moving south, still powerful. Writing Life on the Mississippi brought back the old feelings. The excitement of being young and learning to read the water. The pride of earning his pilot's license. The terror of navigating at night. The tragedy of Henry's death. That part he wrote carefully, honestly. It still hurt. The book sold well, not as well as The Innocents Abroad, but respectably. Sam was establishing himself as more than a humorist. He was a serious writer, someone who could handle different genres. Fiction, travel writing, memoir, whatever the story required. In between books, he kept lecturing, kept touring. The family needed the money. The Hartford house wasn't getting cheaper, and now there was another daughter. John, born in 1880. 3 girls now. Susie, Clara, John. The house was full of life, noise, energy. Sam loved it and found it overwhelming in equal measure. He needed his writing time, his quiet. That's what the study at Quarry Farm provided. Summers of uninterrupted work while the girls played in the fields and Livy managed the household. He returned to the Huckleberry Finn manuscript in 1883, picked up where he'd left off. The solution to his plot problem came suddenly. Huck and Jim would miss their chance to go north. They'd drift past Cairo in the fog. After that, they'd just keep going south, meeting characters, having adventures. It wasn't the logical solution, but it was the right one. The story wasn't really about getting Jim to freedom anyway. It was about Huck learning to see Jim as human, learning to question what society had taught him about race and slavery. Sam was writing something dangerous here, something that would make people uncomfortable. The book attacked the institution of slavery, yes, but it also attacked the hypocrisy of post-war America, the way the North had abandoned Reconstruction, the way Jim Crow laws were spreading across the South, the way Black Americans were being denied the freedom they'd supposedly won. He finished the manuscript in 1883, then spent months revising. Livy read it, made suggestions. She wanted some of the rougher language softened. Sam complied mostly. His publisher, James Osgood, had concerns about the book's commercial prospects. It was too controversial, too raw, too honest about American racism. But Sam believed in it. This was his best work. He knew it. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn was published in Britain in December 1884. American edition followed in February 1885. The response was immediate and polarised. Some critics praised it as a masterpiece. Others condemned it as crude, vulgar, unsuitable for children. Public libraries banned it. The Concord Public Library called it trash. Sam was delighted by the controversy. Banning books only increased sales. People wanted to read what they weren't supposed to read. And underneath the outrage, serious readers recognised what he'd accomplished. The book was written entirely in dialect. Multiple dialects, actually. Missouri Negro dialect, Pike County dialect, Southwestern dialect. Each character had their own voice, their own way of speaking. This had never been done before, not at this level. The novel's structure was loose, episodic. Huck and Jim float downriver, encountering different characters and situations. The Duke and the King, 2 con men who take over the raft. The Grangerford-Shepherdson feud. The Wilkes family and the inheritance scheme. Each episode showed American society from a different angle. All of it filtered through Huck's innocent but perceptive eyes. The moral centre of the book comes late. Huck has to decide whether to turn Jim in or help him escape. Society has taught him that helping a slave escape is a sin. He'll go to hell for it. He writes a letter to Jim's owner. Then he tears it up. Says, "All right then, I'll go to hell." Chooses friendship over law, humanity over society's rules. That moment is the book's heart. Everything builds toward it, and it's devastating because Huck thinks he's doing wrong when he's actually doing right. The society that's supposed to guide him is morally bankrupt. His conscience, which should tell him the truth, has been corrupted by slave state ideology. He has to go against everything he's been taught to do, the decent thing. Sam understood this. He'd grown up in a slave state. He'd been taught the same lies. It took him years to unlearn them. The book was his attempt to show how deeply those lies penetrated, how they twisted even good people's understanding of right and wrong. Critics who called the book racist missed the point entirely. Sam was attacking racism by showing it from the inside, by demonstrating how it corrupted language, thought, morality. Huck uses the language of his time and place. That language is offensive, but Huck's actions, his growing recognition of Jim's humanity, That's the counter-argument. The book doesn't endorse the racism it depicts. It exposes it. Hemingway would later say, all modern American literature comes from this book. That's probably an exaggeration, but not by much. Huckleberry Finn showed American writers they could use vernacular language. They could write about ordinary people in ordinary speech. They didn't have to imitate British novels or classical literature. They could create something distinctly American. The book made Sam wealthy, not immediately, but over time. It kept selling, year after year, decade after decade, became required reading in schools, though that would have horrified the Concord Library Board. But wealth brought its own problems. Sam had never been good with money. Success made him worse. He started investing, mostly in inventions, things that promised to revolutionize industry, make fortunes overnight. A new kind of steam engine, an improved typewriter, a marine telegraph, most of them failed. Sam lost money steadily, but he kept investing, kept believing the next one would pay off. The biggest disaster was the Page Compositor, a typesetting machine invented by James Page. It was supposed to replace human typesetters, do the work of several men at once. Sam saw a demonstration in 1880. He was mesmerized. This was the future. This would transform publishing. He started investing, small amounts at first, then larger sums. The machine kept needing improvements. Page kept promising it was almost ready. Sam kept writing checks. By the late 1880s, he'd put over $190,000 into the Compositor, more than he'd made from all his books combined. The machine was brilliant in theory. 12,000 moving parts. It could set type, distribute it, justify lines. Everything a human compositor did, but faster. Except it didn't work reliably. Something was always breaking. Page would fix it, and something else would break. The machine was too complex, too delicate. It couldn't handle the rough conditions of a working print shop. While Sam was pouring money into Page's machine, a rival inventor named Ottmar Mergenthaler was developing a simpler device, the linotype. It did less than the Page Compositor, but what it did reliably. By 1890, newspapers were adopting linotype machines. Page's Compositor became obsolete before it was even finished. Sam refused to see it. He'd invested too much to quit. He borrowed money, mortgaged the Hartford house, convinced himself the breakthrough was coming. Any day now, Page would solve the technical problems. The Compositor would work. Sam would make millions. It never happened. The manuscript grew, chapter by chapter. The white picket fence, the murder in the graveyard, Becky Thatcher, and the cave. It was coming together faster than anything he'd written before. Pure pleasure, this kind of writing. No research required. No facts to verify. Just memory and imagination, blended until you couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. The book was published in December 1876, though it had been finished the previous year. American publication got delayed. British edition came first. Sam wasn't happy about that, but at least it was out. Reviews were mixed. Some critics found it too crude, too vernacular. Children's literature was supposed to be improving, morally instructive. Tom Sawyer was neither. It was about a boy who lied, stole, played hooky, and generally caused trouble. But kids loved it. Adults too, the ones willing to read something that didn't preach. Sales were decent, not spectacular but steady. The book would keep selling for decades. But Sam didn't know that yet. All he knew was that he'd written something true. Something that captured what it felt like to be a boy in Missouri before the war. While working on Tom Sawyer, another character had emerged. Huck Finn, the boy on the margins, Tom's sidekick, but more interesting in some ways, freer, less constrained by civilization. Sam had already decided Huck needed his own book, but that would come later. First, there was money to think about. The Hartford house was expensive, not just to build but to maintain. Servants, property taxes, heating bills in winter. Livy ran the household efficiently, but efficiency only went so far when you were trying to maintain a mansion. The money came in unpredictable bursts. Royalties paid quarterly, sometimes delayed. Lecturing was the answer. Sam had been doing speaking tours since the 1860s. He was good at it. Better than good. Audiences adored him. He could make them laugh, make them think, hold their attention for an hour or more with nothing but his voice and presence. The pay was substantial. $100 per lecture, sometimes more. Do 30 lectures in a season, and you had real money. So he toured, fall and winter, leaving Livy and the girls in Hartford. He'd travel by train from city to city: Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, sometimes as far west as Chicago or St. Louis. Each night a different hall, different audience, same routine. Walk on stage, pause, let the applause settle. Begin slowly, conversationally. Build to the funny parts, time the pauses perfectly. Watch the audience, gauge their reactions, adjust accordingly. It was performance, theatre. Sam had learned timing from years of telling stories in saloons and newspaper offices. He knew how to work a crowd, when to speed up, when to slow down, when to drop his voice so people leaned forward to hear, when to raise it for emphasis. The lectures weren't speeches exactly. They were crafted narratives, stories with structure. Beginning, middle, end, characters, conflict, resolution. Just like his writing, but spoken. The tours were exhausting. The travel wore him down. Bad food in railroad dining cars, uncomfortable hotel beds, constant movement. No time to write, no time to think. Just perform, sleep, travel, perform again. But the money was good, and Sam was building his reputation. Mark Twain wasn't just a name in newspapers and on book covers. He was a presence, a personality. People wanted to see him, hear him, shake his hand. Back at Quarry Farm in summer 1876, he started a new project, a book about Huck Finn. He'd been thinking about it since finishing Tom Sawyer. This time the story would be bigger, darker, more ambitious. Huck would run away from his abusive father. He'd team up with Jim, a runaway slave. They'd float down the Mississippi on a raft. The writing went well at first. The early chapters poured out. Huck's voice was clear, distinct from Tom's. More colloquial, more honest. Sam was writing in dialect, capturing how people actually talked in Missouri. Not proper grammar, not refined language. The real thing. Critics would later call this revolutionary. At the time, Sam just knew it sounded right, but then he got stuck. Around chapter 16, the story stalled. He didn't know where to take it next. The raft was floating south, deeper into slave territory. That was the wrong direction. Huck and Jim needed to get north, to freedom. But Sam had written them into a corner, so he set the manuscript aside, put it in a drawer, moved on to other things. This would become his pattern with Huckleberry Finn. Write for a while, get stuck, stop, come back months or years later. The book took 7 years to complete. Not because Sam was slow, but because he kept abandoning it. The story was harder than Tom Sawyer, more complicated, more serious underneath the humour. Meanwhile, there was another book to write, a travel book. Sam had been taking notes about his riverboat days, his memories of learning to pilot steamboats. He'd written some of it years earlier. Now he expanded it into Life on the Mississippi, published in 1883. The book combined memoir and travelogue, part nostalgia for the old river days, part observation of how the river had changed since the war. To research the second half, Sam travelled down the Mississippi in 1882. First time he'd been back since before the war. 20 years. The river was different, smaller somehow. The romance was gone. Steamboats were being replaced by railroads. The towns had changed, but the river itself, the physical reality of it, was still there, still moving south, still powerful. Writing Life on the Mississippi brought back the old feelings, the excitement of being young and learning to read the water. the pride of earning his pilot's license, the terror of navigating at night, the tragedy of Henry's death. That part he wrote carefully. Honestly, it still hurt. The book sold well. Not as well as The Innocents Abroad, but respectably. Sam was establishing himself as more than a humorist. He was a serious writer, someone who could handle different genres: fiction, travel writing, memoir, whatever the story required. In between books, he kept lecturing, kept touring. The family needed the money. The Hertford house wasn't getting cheaper. And now there was another daughter, Joan, born in 1880. 3 girls now: Susie, Clara, John. The house was full of life, noise, energy. Sam loved it and found it overwhelming in equal measure. He needed his writing time, his quiet. That's what the study at Quarry Farm provided. Summers of uninterrupted work while the girls played in the fields and Livy managed the household. He returned to the Huckleberry Finn manuscript in 1883, picked up where he'd left off. The solution to his plot problem came suddenly. Huck and Jim would miss their chance to go north. They'd drift past Cairo in the fog. After that, they'd just keep going south, meeting characters, having adventures. It wasn't the logical solution, but it was the right one. The story wasn't really about getting Jim to freedom anyway. It was about Huck learning to see Jim as human, learning to question what society had taught him about race and slavery. Sam was writing something dangerous here, something that would make people uncomfortable. The book attacked the institution of slavery, yes, but it also attacked the hypocrisy of post-war America, the way the North had abandoned Reconstruction, the way Jim Crow laws were spreading across the South, the way Black Americans were being denied the freedom they'd supposedly won. He finished the manuscript in 1883, then spent months revising. Livy read it, made suggestions. She wanted some of the rougher language softened. Sam complied mostly. His publisher, James Osgood, had concerns about the book's commercial prospects. It was too controversial, too raw, too honest about American racism. But Sam believed in it. This was his best work. He knew it. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn was published in Britain in December 1884. American edition followed in February 1885. The response was immediate and polarised. Some critics praised it as a masterpiece. Others condemned it as crude, vulgar, unsuitable for children. Public libraries banned it. The Concord Public Library called it trash. Sam was delighted by the controversy. Banning books only increased sales. People wanted to read what they weren't supposed to read. And underneath the outrage, serious readers recognised what he'd accomplished. The book was written entirely in dialect, multiple dialects actually: Missouri Negro dialect, Pike County dialect, Southwestern dialect. Each character had their own voice, their own way of speaking. This had never been done before, not at this level. The novel's structure was loose, episodic. Huck and Jim float downriver, encountering different characters and situations. The Duke and the King, 2 con men who take over the raft, the Grangerford-Shepherdson feud, the Wilkes family, and the inheritance scheme. Each episode showed American society from a different angle, all of it filtered through Huck's innocent but perceptive eyes. The moral centre of the book comes late. Huck has to decide whether to turn Jim in or help him escape. Society has taught him that helping a slave escape is a sin. The society that's supposed to guide him is morally bankrupt. His conscience, which should tell him the truth, has been corrupted by slave state ideology. He has to go against everything he's been taught to do, the decent thing. Sam understood this. He'd grown up in a slave state. He'd been taught the same lies. It took him years to unlearn them. The book was his attempt to show how deeply those lies penetrated, how they twisted even good people's understanding of right and wrong. Critics who called the book racist missed the point entirely. Sam was attacking racism by showing it from the inside, by demonstrating how it corrupted language, thought, morality. Huck uses the language of his time and place. That language is offensive. But Huck's actions, his growing recognition of Jim's humanity, that's the counter-argument. The book doesn't endorse the racism it depicts, it exposes it. Hemingway would later say, all modern American literature comes from this book. That's probably an exaggeration, but not by much. Huckleberry Finn showed American writers they could use vernacular language. They could write about ordinary people in ordinary speech. They didn't have to imitate British novels or classical literature. They could create something distinctly American. The book made Sam wealthy. Not immediately, but over time. It kept selling. Year after year. Decade after decade. Became required reading in schools, though that would have horrified the Concord Library Board. But wealth brought its own problems. Sam had never been good with money. Success made him worse. He started investing, mostly in inventions, things that promised to revolutionize industry, make fortunes overnight. A new kind of steam engine, an improved typewriter, a marine telegraph. Most of them failed. Sam lost money steadily, but he kept investing, kept believing the next one would pay off. The biggest disaster was the Page Compositor, a typesetting machine invented by James Page. It was supposed to replace human typesetters, do the work of several men at once. Sam saw a demonstration in 1880. He was mesmerized. This was the future. This would transform publishing. He started investing, small amounts at first, then larger sums. The machine kept needing improvements. Page kept promising it was almost ready. Sam kept writing checks. By the late 1880s, he'd put over $190,000 into the Compositor, more than he'd made from all his books combined. The machine was brilliant in theory. 12,000 moving parts. It could set type, distribute it, justify lines, everything a human compositor did, but faster. Except it didn't work reliably. Something was always breaking. Page would fix it, and something else would break. The machine was too complex, too delicate. It couldn't handle the rough conditions of a working print shop. While Sam was pouring money into Page's machine, a rival inventor named Ottmar Mergenthaler was developing a simpler device, the linotype. It did less than the Page Compositor, but what it did reliably. By 1890, newspapers were adopting linotype machines. Page's Compositor became obsolete before it was even finished. Sam refused to see it. He'd invested too much to admit defeat, too much pride, too much money already spent. He kept believing Page would fix it. One more adjustment, one more improvement, then it would work. Meanwhile, his publishing company was bleeding money too. Charles Webster and Company. Sam had started it in 1884 to publish his own books and others. At first it was successful. Published Grant's memoirs, huge seller, made a fortune for Grant's widow. Sam felt good about that, helping his friend's family. But success brought problems. Sam started signing too many authors, publishing too many books. The overhead grew. The company needed constant infusions of cash. Sam kept writing checks, borrowing money, taking out loans, using his literary earnings to prop up failing businesses. By 1891, the situation was desperate. Sam owed massive debts. The publishing company was collapsing. The Page Compositor still didn't work. He was traveling constantly, trying to earn money through lectures and articles. Livy was stressed. The family's finances were a disaster. In 1894, the publishing company failed completely. Bankruptcy. Sam owed about $90,000, more than $2 million in today's money. At age 58, he was ruined. The man who'd written some of America's most beloved books was broke. The shame was crushing. Sam had always been proud, always presented himself as successful. Now newspapers were running stories about his financial failure, his incompetence as a businessman. Some people gloated, others felt sorry for him. Sam hated both reactions equally. Bankruptcy law would have let him settle his debts for pennies on the dollar. pay a fraction of what he owed and walk away. But Sam refused. Livy refused. They'd borrowed money from friends, from business associates. They felt morally obligated to pay back every cent, even if it took years. Henry Rogers helped, Standard Oil executive, one of the most powerful businessmen in America. Also ruthless, the kind of man Sam had criticized in his writing. But Rogers genuinely liked Sam, admired his work, and he was good with money in ways Sam would never be. Rogers took over Sam's finances, reorganized everything, set up a payment plan for the debts, gave Sam a salary, told him to write and lecture. Let Rogers handle the business side. It was humiliating, being managed like a child, but it was necessary. Sam knew that. The plan was brutal. Sam would tour the world, give lectures, write about his travels, earn money. All of it would go toward the debt. He was 60 years old, tired, in poor health, but he had no choice. In July 1895, Sam, Livy and their daughter Clara left for a lecture tour, starting in the American West, then to Australia, New Zealand, India, South Africa. A year-long circuit of the British Empire, performing nearly every night, travelling constantly. The other two daughters stayed home. Susie was 23, Jan was 15. They remained in the Hertford house with family friends. The separation was hard, but someone had to stay, and the tour would be grueling. Too much for everyone to endure. Sam performed brilliantly. Years of lecturing had made him a master showman. He knew how to work a crowd, how to time a joke, how to shift from humour to sentiment and back. Audiences loved him. Packed theatres everywhere he went. But the travel was exhausting. Different city every few days, long train rides, uncomfortable hotels, bad food. Sam's health suffered. He developed bronchitis, carbuncles, various infections, kept performing anyway. Had to. The debt wouldn't pay itself. He wrote letters home, constantly, to Susie and Jean, telling them about the places he'd seen, the people he'd met, making jokes to keep their spirits up, missing them terribly. The letters were cheerful on the surface, desperate underneath. In August 1896, they were in England. The tour was nearly over. One more month and they'd be home. Sam was exhausted but relieved. They'd earned enough to pay most of the debt. Maybe not all of it immediately, but enough to show good faith, to prove they were serious about repaying. Then the telegram arrived. Susie was sick, meningitis. Come home immediately. They tried, booked passage on the fastest ship, but crossing the Atlantic took days. No way to get word. No way to know what was happening. Sam paced the deck. Couldn't sleep. Couldn't eat. Just waited, helpless. Another telegram when they landed. Too late. Susie had died August 18th, aged 24, while her parents were on the other side of the world. The funeral had already happened. She was buried before they even knew she was gone. Sam broke, completely. He'd lost his son Langdon 24 years earlier. That had been terrible. But Susie, his firstborn daughter, his favourite, though he tried not to admit it, brilliant, talented, sensitive, the one who understood him best, gone. He blamed himself. Of course he did. If he'd managed his money better, if he hadn't invested in the Page Compositor, if he hadn't started the publishing company, they wouldn't have needed the tour. They would have been home. Maybe they could have gotten her better treatment. Maybe she'd have lived. Livy blamed him too, not explicitly, but he could see it. She'd always worried about his financial recklessness. Now her daughter was dead because of it, or that's how it felt. The grief was enormous, suffocating. The Hertford house, which had been full of life and laughter, became unbearable. They couldn't stay there. Too many memories, too much pain. They rented it out, moved to New York, then to Vienna, then to London, kept moving, trying to escape the grief, but it followed them everywhere. Sam threw himself into work, wrote constantly, anything to avoid thinking about Susie, but she was in everything he wrote, The loss coloured every page. His writing changed, got darker, more bitter. The humour was still there, but it had an edge now, a cruelty. He'd always been cynical about human nature. Now the cynicism deepened into something closer to misanthropy. In 1897, Following the Equator was published. His account of the world tour. It sold well. Critics praised it. But Sam knew it wasn't his best work. Too much of it was written in grief. Too much forced cheerfulness covering despair. The money helped though. By 1898, they'd paid off most of the debt. By 1900, it was gone entirely. Every penny repaid. Sam had redeemed himself financially, but the cost had been his daughter's life. The victory felt hollow. He kept writing, kept publishing, but the joy was gone. Writing had always been work, but work he loved. Now it was just work, something he did because he was good at it, because people expected it, because it paid the bills. In 1898, he started working on a book called The Mysterious Stranger, a dark philosophical tale set in medieval Austria. It questioned everything: God, morality, human purpose. The main character was Satan, portrayed sympathetically, more honest than the humans around him. Sam worked on it for years, couldn't finish it, kept revising, changing the setting, rewriting the ending. The book refused to come together, maybe because it was too personal, too close to what he really thought about existence, too dark to publish under his name. He also wrote essays, fierce, angry attacks on imperialism. America was acquiring colonies. Philippines, Puerto Rico, Hawaii. Sam was disgusted. This wasn't what America was supposed to be. This was European empire building, the thing they'd rebelled against. He wrote To the Person Sitting in Darkness, a scathing critique of Western colonialism disguised as civilization, the missionary work, the economic exploitation, all of it justified with lies about helping the savages. Sam saw through it, called it what it was: theft and murder dressed up as progress. The essay made people angry. Good. Sam wanted them angry, wanted them uncomfortable. He was done being just a humorist, done making people laugh while they ignored injustice. If they wanted Mark Twain, they'd get the real one, not the safe, sanitized version. In 1904, Livy died. Heart failure. She'd been sick for years. Sam had nursed her, tried to keep her comfortable, but she was exhausted, worn down by grief and illness. She died in Florence, age 58. They'd been married 34 years. Now Sam had lost his wife and 2 of his children. Only Clara and Jean remained. And Jean had epilepsy, frequent seizures. She needed constant care. Clara was the healthy one, but she was building her own life, pursuing a singing career. She couldn't be his caretaker. Sam moved back to America, rented a house in New York, then built a house in Connecticut, called it Stormfield. It was supposed to be his final home, place to settle down, write in peace. But he was 73 years old, tired, sick, running out of time. He kept writing though, couldn't stop. It was what he did, who he was, but more and more he wrote for himself, not for publication. Dark essays about human nature, religion, death. Some of it was brilliant, some was rambling and bitter. None of it was commercial. His published work in these final years was lighter, reminiscences, stories from his youth. People wanted the old Mark Twain, the funny one, the nostalgic one. Sam gave them what they wanted, saved the darkness for his private papers. In 1906, he started dictating his autobiography. Not writing it, dictating. He'd lie in bed smoking cigars and talk. A stenographer took it down. He rambled, told stories, jumped between topics, made jokes, got angry. It was chaotic, unfocused, exactly what he wanted. He said he was writing it to be published after his death, 100 years after. That way he could be completely honest, say things he couldn't say while people were alive, attack his enemies, reveal secrets, Tell the truth without consequences. Whether he meant it or just enjoyed the idea, who knows? But the autobiography was massive, hundreds of thousands of words, most of it unpublishable in his lifetime, some of it unpublishable, period. He didn't care. It wasn't for contemporary readers, it was for posterity, or for himself, a way to process his life before it ended. He was famous now in a way he'd never been before, not just a successful author, a cultural icon, the grand old man of American letters. People sought him out, wanted to meet him, hear him speak. He played the role, wore white suits, made witty remarks, gave interviews. But it was performance. The real Sam, whoever that was, stayed hidden. In 1909, John died, Christmas Eve, drowned in the bathtub during a seizure, aged 29. Sam found her. Last of his children, except Clara. The grief was beyond words. He wrote about it. Had to. Writing was how he processed everything. But the words felt inadequate, empty. What was there to say? He was 74, sick, broken, ready to die. He'd outlived almost everyone he loved. His wife, 3 of his children, most of his friends. He was alone, famous and alone. His health was failing rapidly, heart disease, angina. He knew the end was close. Told people he'd come in with Halley's Comet in 1835. He'd go out with it in 1910. The comet was due back in April. Sam planned to meet the deadline? He did. April 21st, 1910. The comet was visible in the sky. Sam died at Stormfield, age 74. Clara was there, and a few servants, that was it. The man who'd been the most famous writer in America died quietly, almost privately. The newspapers filled with tributes, obituaries, remembrances. Everyone had a Mark Twain story. Something funny he'd said, something wise. The public mourned. But most of them were mourning an image, a character, the white-suited humorist, the gentle satirist, the beloved American voice. They didn't know the bitter old man who'd lost everything, who'd spent his final years raging against God and humanity, who'd written thousands of pages he couldn't publish because they were too dark, too angry, too honest. The funeral was public, massive. Everyone who was anyone attended, all sent condolences. The tributes poured in. Presidents, writers, publishers, ordinary readers who felt they'd lost a friend. The body lay in state at a Presbyterian church in New York. Thousands filed past, paying respects to a man most of them had never really known. The burial was in Elmira, next to Livy, next to Susie, next to Jean. The family plot. Together again. Finally. Clara arranged everything. She was all that was left, the only survivor of Sam's immediate family. She'd have to carry the legacy alone. The obituaries were everywhere. Front page news, Mark Twain was dead. The papers ran photos. The famous white suit, the wild hair, the moustache, the stern but twinkling eyes. They quoted his best lines, his funniest jokes, his wisest observations. They called him America's greatest humorist, the people's writer, the voice of a generation. They got it mostly wrong. Not completely, but they simplified, made him digestible, comfortable, turned him into the image they wanted. The kindly old man with the sharp wit and the gentle wisdom. They ignored the rage, the bitterness, the despair, the darkness that had consumed his final years. They didn't want to know about that, didn't want to remember him that way. So they created their own Mark Twain, the one they could celebrate, the one who made them laugh, the one who reminded them of simpler times, childhood, innocence, the Mississippi River, Tom Sawyer, Huck Finn, that Mark Twain. Not the one who'd written The Mysterious Stranger, not the one who'd spent years attacking God and humanity in private manuscripts, not the broken old man who'd buried his entire family. The public got the myth, the private papers contained the truth, And Clara, whether she realised it or not, became the guardian of both. She had a problem though. Her father had left behind an enormous amount of unpublished material. The autobiography alone was massive, rambling, unorganised, unpublishable in its raw form. Then there were the essays, the stories, the fragments, thousands of pages, some of it brilliant, some of it bitter, all of it Sam. What was she supposed to do with it? He'd said to publish it after his death. 100 years after, but he'd also said a lot of things, changed his mind constantly, left contradictory instructions. The more Clara looked at the papers, the more complicated it became. She started with the autobiography, hired Albert Bigelow Paine, who'd been helping Sam in his final years, to organise it, edit it, make it publishable. Paine was a good choice, loyal, respectful, but also willing to cut, to shape, to protect Sam's reputation from Sam himself. The first volume came out in 1924, 14 years after Sam's death. It was heavily edited, cleaned up, the roughest edges smoothed, the darkest passages removed. It was still Sam's voice, still his stories, but filtered, made acceptable for public consumption. The reviews were positive, people bought it, but scholars even then knew it wasn't the complete picture. More volumes followed. Paine kept working, kept editing, but he was working from his own understanding of what Mark Twain should be, what the public needed to see. He wasn't trying to deceive anyone. He was trying to honour Sam's legacy, as he understood it. The problem was that honouring the legacy meant hiding parts of the man, the parts that didn't fit, the parts that would shock or offend, the parts that would make people uncomfortable. Paine made choices, Clara made choices. They decided what the world could handle and what it couldn't. Meanwhile, the unpublished manuscripts sat in boxes, waiting. Some of them wouldn't see print for decades. Some still haven't, not fully, not exactly as written. Because Sam had been right about one thing, the world wasn't ready for all of it, maybe never would be. But the books that had been published, those lived on. Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn, The Innocents Abroad, Life on the Mississippi, they became American classics, required reading in schools, beloved by generations of readers. Tom and Huck became part of the cultural DNA. Everyone knew them, even people who'd never read the books, Huckleberry Finn especially. It became the great American novel, the book Ernest Hemingway said all American literature came from, the book that captured something essential about America: freedom, individualism, the river, the journey, the friendship between Huck and Jim, the moral awakening, the rejection of civilization's corrupt values. It was also controversial, because of how Sam wrote Jim, because of the language. The N-word appears over 200 times. Sam was writing in dialect, capturing how people actually talked, showing the racism of the time, criticizing it through the story. But that didn't stop people from being offended, from wanting to ban the book, from calling it racist. The debate started early, never really stopped. Schools banned it, libraries pulled it, parents objected, but scholars defended it. Teachers taught it, readers loved it. The controversy kept it alive, relevant, debated, which maybe Sam would have appreciated. He'd never shied from controversy. The other books remained popular too, but none matched Huck Finn. That one stood alone, the masterpiece, the book that justified everything else, the proof that Sam had been more than just a humorist, more than just a performer, a genuine artist, a writer who'd created something lasting. His reputation grew over the decades, not just as a writer, as a cultural icon, the quintessential American, the self-made man, the river pilot turned author, the Westerner who'd conquered the Eastern literary establishment, the Democrat with a small d who'd spoken for the common man against the rich and powerful. Scholars started studying him seriously. Not just the books, the man, his life, his methods, his influences, universities offered courses, dissertations were written. The Mark Twain Papers project at Berkeley began collecting and preserving everything: letters, manuscripts, notebooks, trying to create a complete record. What they found was complicated, contradictions everywhere. The anti-imperialist who'd invested in colonialism, the advocate for racial justice who'd sometimes used racial stereotypes, the critic of religion who'd married into a religious family, the cynic who'd loved his wife and children desperately, the humorist who'd been depressed for years, the performer who'd hated performing. None of it fit together neatly, which made him human, real, not the sanitized version, not the myth, the actual person, flawed, struggling, trying to make sense of a world that didn't make sense. His influence on American literature was undeniable. Everyone who came after had to deal with him, had to acknowledge him. Hemingway, Faulkner, Salinger, Vonnegut, they all owed something to Sam, to his use of American vernacular, his eye for character, his ability to mix humor and tragedy, his willingness to tackle serious themes through accessible stories. He'd shown that American writers didn't need to imitate Europeans, didn't need to write like English novelists or French realists. They could write like Americans, in American voices, about American experiences, and create something just as valid, just as literary, just as important. That was his real legacy, not just the specific books, the permission, the proof that it could be done, that American literature could exist on its own terms, with its own voice, its own standards, its own greatness. The white suit became iconic. Photos of old Sam in his white suit and wild hair appeared everywhere, on book covers, in classrooms, in documentaries. It was the image people thought of when they thought of Mark Twain, the showman, the performer, the character he'd created for himself in his later years. But that character was only part of the story. The real Sam had been the boy in Hannibal, the pilot on the river, the young reporter in Nevada, the struggling author in Hartford, the grief-stricken father in Europe, the bitter old man dictating his autobiography. All of those people, all of those versions, they were all him, all equally true, all equally Sam. Clara lived until 1962, 52 years after her father's death. She spent much of that time managing his legacy, protecting it, controlling what was published, what was revealed. She meant well. Loved her father, wanted people to remember him properly. But her control meant that parts of Sam remained hidden. Parts that might have complicated the image, made it harder to sell books, harder to maintain the legend. When she died, the remaining restrictions loosened. Scholars got more access, published more of the unpublished material. The autobiography came out in fuller versions. The dark essays, the bitter attacks on religion and humanity. The private thoughts Sam had wanted kept private. Or had he? His instructions had been so contradictory, so changeable. Nobody really knew what he'd wanted. What became clear was that Mark Twain, the public figure, and Samuel Clemens, the private person, were different, related but distinct. The public figure was the creation, the performance, the brand. The private person was messy, complicated, often miserable. The public figure made people laugh. The private person struggled to find reasons to keep living. Both were real. Both mattered. You couldn't understand one without the other. The humour came from the pain, the satire from the anger, the warmth from the love he'd felt and lost, the cynicism from the idealism that had been disappointed too many times. His books kept selling, generation after generation. Kids still read Tom Sawyer in school, argued about Huckleberry Finn. Adults rediscovered the travel books, the essays, the short stories. Mark Twain never went out of print, never stopped being relevant, because he'd written about things that didn't change. Human nature, greed, hypocrisy, love, loss, the gap between what people said and what they did. He'd also written about America, Not the America of myths and propaganda, the real America, contradictory, violent, idealistic, corrupt, beautiful, ugly, all at once. He'd loved it and hated it, celebrated it and criticized it, believed in its potential while despairing at its failures. That complexity resonated, still does, because America is still all those things, still contradictory, still struggling with the same issues: race, class, power, justice. Reading Sam now, you can see him wrestling with questions that haven't been answered, problems that haven't been solved. He didn't have solutions, just observations, questions, provocations. That's what made him valuable. Not that he provided answers, but that he asked the right questions in ways that made people think, made them laugh, made them uncomfortable, made them see things differently. The comet came back in 1985, 75 years after Sam's death, right on schedule. People remembered his prediction, how he'd said he'd come in with it and go out with it, how he'd been right. It became part of the legend. Mark Twain, born with Halley's Comet, died with it. Cosmically significant, chosen by fate, special. The truth was simpler and sadder. He'd been a man, talented, driven, lucky, unlucky, loved, heartbroken, successful, bankrupt, famous, alone. He'd lived, suffered, created, died, like everyone else. The comet was just coincidence, timing. But people wanted it to mean something, wanted him to mean something. To be more than just another dead writer. Maybe he was. Not because of the comet, because of the words he'd left behind. The characters, the stories, the observations, the questions. They outlived him. Will probably outlive all of us. That's what writers get, if they're lucky, if they're good enough. Immortality of a sort. Not the person, the work. Sam wanted to be remembered, feared being forgotten, spent his life building a reputation, creating a legacy, worrying about posterity. He needn't have worried. We're still reading him, still arguing about him, still trying to figure him out, still trying to figure him out. Maybe that's the point. Maybe writers aren't meant to be figured out. They're meant to be read, interpreted, argued over. Each generation finding something different, taking what they need, leaving what doesn't fit. The scholars keep working, publishing new editions, finding lost manuscripts, debating what Sam really meant, what he really believed. They'll never finish. There's always another letter, another notebook, another fragment that complicates the picture. The casual readers don't care about any of that. They just want Tom and Huck, the Mississippi, the humour, the adventure. They read the books their parents read, their grandparents read, pass them on to their own kids. The cycle continues. Teachers keep teaching Huckleberry Finn, keep defending it against challenges, keep explaining that the language is offensive, but the book isn't, that showing racism isn't endorsing it, that context matters, that art can make you uncomfortable and still be valuable. Some students get it, some don't. The debate won't end. And somewhere in all of this, Sam Clemens exists. Not the legend, not the icon, the actual person who lived and suffered and created, who loved his wife, who buried his children, who made terrible business decisions, who wrote brilliantly and sometimes poorly, who performed when he had to, who hid when he could. He exists in fragments, in contradictions, in the gaps between what he said and what he meant, between what he published and what he hid, between Mark Twain the character and Samuel Clemens the man. The white suit was costume, the humour was armour, the cynicism was disappointment, the anger was grief. The words were everything, the only thing he could control, the only thing that lasted. He wrote himself into existence, created a persona so convincing that it replaced him. Mark Twain became more real than Sam Clemens, more important, more memorable. That was probably the goal. or part of it. Writers do this. Build something that outlasts the body, the voice that keeps speaking after the throat goes silent. The manuscripts are still being published. The autobiography finally came out complete in 2010, 100 years after his death. Just like he said, sort of. The editors still made choices, still organized, still interpreted. You can't publish chaos, but it's closer to what he wrote, closer to what he thought, the darkness included. Readers were surprised, the bitterness shocked them. The attacks on religion offended some. The pessimism about human nature disturbed others. This wasn't the gentle humorist they remembered. This was someone angrier, more damaged, more honest. Which version is real? Both. Neither. All of them. People contain multitudes, contradict themselves, change over time. The young Sam who piloted steamboats wasn't the same person as the old Sam dictating autobiography. Same body, different person. Life does that. Especially life with that much loss. 3 children dead, wife dead, brother dead, most of his friends dead. Financial ruin, public humiliation, chronic pain, depression. Anyone would be bitter. Anyone would rage. The miracle isn't that he got dark. It's that he kept writing, kept performing, kept trying. Some people say his later work is lesser, diminished by grief and anger. They prefer the earlier books, the ones written when he was happy, when life still held possibility. Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn, The Innocents Abroad. Those are the classics. The late stuff is just sad. Others disagree. Say the darkness made the work deeper, more honest, that the late essays and stories show what he'd been hiding all along. The doubt, the fear, the suspicion that life was meaningless and humanity was doomed. That this Sam, the broken one, was the real one. The earlier optimism was the lie. Both readings miss something. The early work isn't naive. The late work isn't just bitter. Throughout his career, Sam was wrestling with the same questions. About meaning, about morality,